You have arrived at the 13th floor. Ask yourself, is my mind open enough to enter here?
Near-death experiences. People pass away and then come back to consciousness, and they have stories to tell. And today's show, we have a scientist who personally had his own. He wrote a book called Proof of Heaven, and then Living in a Mindful Universe. He's a speaker. Eben Alexander is lecturing. He's also, again, the key word, neurosurgeon. I don't know how many years of college. That takes a lot of years of college.
A lot of years.
And if he's telling us something happened, we owe it to listen to what he has to say and also where things are going.
His near-death experience is even more unique than a lot of the ones that you've heard. He came back profoundly changed.
We're recording this in 2019. I always try to keep a timeline. Yes. This happened to him, what was it? Was it 13? Do you recall? It's been a number of years. Yeah. 5, 6, 7.
Yeah, I want to say, I know he references 2008 a lot, but I want to say it was either 2008 or 2013. I can't remember. I read both his books, but it's been a couple of weeks now and binge and purge, you know.
Eben Alexander has been on multiple talk shows.
He's a New York Times bestseller too.
Yeah, the Proof of Heaven book, really, if you don't know about that book, I mean, I had heard about this book a long time ago. The Proof of Heaven really did open up a lot of eyes.
And he'll go into the science, you know, he has doctors, he has MRIs, he has CAT scans, he has all of these things to back up the fact the guy they were literally getting ready to pull the plug that day when he awoke. So we'll get into all that.
He was that close to death.
He was.
His near death was
0%
almost
chance,
dead.
0% chance of survival.
And I didn't know until I was reading through the notes and stuff that Jamie had put together researching this, that their MRIs are the full bodied and then our MRAs, which I guess are more acute, more specific. So they did really study his condition and how ill this man was. So let's bring him on. Yeah. Dr. Eben Alexander is a neuroscientist, and thank you for joining us, Doctor.
Well, it's great to be here. I appreciate it, Rich and Jamie. Thanks for having me on.
What did you used to think back in your old days when you would hear people tell stories? Oh, yeah, I had a near-death experience, or I had something that was unexplainable, unseen, and your scientific mind said...
Well, you know, I was open-minded. I was looking for answers. These people were very earnest in their stories. Some of them were really kind of shocking. I wanted to know some answers, but I must say I defaulted to my materialist neuroscientific training in trying to answer these questions. And that conventional training is deeply steeped in just pure materialism or physicalism, the notion that only the physical world exists. I must say, and as I explain in the book Proof of Heaven, you know, in the year 2000, there were events in my life that really led me into a dark night of the soul for 8 years. So I really, during those 8 years, up until my coma in 2008, had come to really doubt the reality of a loving personal God or the power of prayer. I mean, I was kind of staunchly agnostic those 8 years. Near-death experiences are very, very common. Tens of millions of Americans have probably had them. They're so shocking that if you come back to this world after that, especially if you've never heard of them before, you're very concerned that maybe people think you're crazy, so people don't talk about it much. And yet, there's such a huge part of the fabric of human existence that I believe Proof of Heaven really resonated with people, and that's why it was on the New York Times bestseller list. It was in the #1 position for 42 weeks, and it was on that list for almost 2 years. So it definitely, and it's really about the science. That's the thing that makes this awakening and this revolution so strong. It's really based in scientific knowledge and examination of the world around us.
Do you think, too, that part of this is the fact that you are a neurosurgeon and you have credibility because of that, because of your studies and your previous life before that experience?
Well, I can tell you where I went on my journey. Being a neurosurgeon and spending all those years at Harvard doesn't mean squat. But in our world, it does. And so in our world, I guess people were looking, for an authority, that is, somebody with a scientific background and scientific credentials, to validate this kind of journey.
As a neuroscientist, how many years of post-education did you have to go through?
Well, the
never ends, though, right? I mean, it keeps.
Well, I had 4 years of medical school that ended in 1980, and then I had a 7-year residency training program at Duke that ended in 1987. I did a fellowship over in England, so that was basically 8 years, and then I had a job finally. Mm-hmm. So time to get down to work after all that training. But that's about what goes into it all.
So tell us about the day that you fell ill.
Well, up until that time, I had honed this scientific worldview, believing the brain creates consciousness. And then I woke up at 4:30 in the morning, November 10th, 2008, with severe back pain. Soon thereafter, realized I had the worst headache I could ever imagine. But anyone who hears that kind of information, severe headache, back pain, with medical training, you immediately go to meningitis. But I was already so far gone from this world, my brain was being overrun by this extremely aggressive, primitive, and absolutely should have killed me bacterial meningitis. And
how is that contracted with? I hear about that frequently on college campus
well, there is
situation.
A form of meningitis that's from a bacterium known as meningococcus, which is very common. I shouldn't say very common, but the way it normally presents is with clusters of cases when people are living together, like college campuses. So yes, meningitis B, meningococcus, is one form of bacterial meningitis. The form I had, gram-negative, E. coli, is the most dangerous form of bacterial meningitis.
What's the survival rate? Is it really that serious?
Well, untreated, it's 100% fatal, period. It just, there's no question about it. But even given aggressive, advanced, modern antibiotic treatment, more than half the cases are devastated and die from it. Now, in my case, I was driven into coma so quickly and deeply, over 3 hours, really. And there's a case report on my medical case that makes all these points very clearly and supports my position in Proof of Heaven about how ill I was and how shocking it was that I experienced anything. That case report is in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease in September 2018. Anybody can access it if you go to my website, ebenalexander.com, go to my blog pages, and right there in September 2018, there's a blog on how the scientific article validates the facts of my case, and there's a link in the 4th paragraph that takes you right to the medical report itself.
And by the way, just for people to look that up again, Eben Alexander is like as in Echo, Bravo, Echo, November, EBEN, Alexander. So you really became ill very, very quickly, unexpectedly. And then did you immediately start to, I want to say the word hallucinate, but we know that's the big argument. What started to happen?
Well, I have no idea when all of that happened. All I know is that it happened deep in coma when, as this medical case report says, the entire time that my near-death experience had to happen, my Glasgow coma scale, which is a measurement of just how deep somebody is in coma, and just for your listening audience, that GCS scale, any one of us would have a score of 15. A corpse would score 3. Anything below 9 is deep coma. And the entire week that I was in coma and had this extraordinary spiritual experience, my Glasgow coma scale the entire time was between basically 6 and 7. So deep coma the entire time with CT and MRI evidence that showed all 8 lobes of my brain had full thickness damage. So there was no place in my brain, according to modern neuroscience, for any kind of consciousness, including a hallucination, dream, or drug effect, to arise. My neocortex was too incapacitated.
That's interesting that you said a corpse even still has A 3. I guess if you go below that, it's like a bad frat party.
Well, there's whoever made that scale, I would have put a corpse at 0. But
right.
Right.
whatever it's worth, I'm just telling you, that
Yeah.
scale, the lowest score you can get is a 3. I was between 6 and 7 the whole time that I had this extraordinary spiritual experience that I talk about in Proof of Heaven. And in fact, that case report, and this was by 3 doctors who were not involved in my care. They were simply fascinated by the outcome. Many doctors who hear my medical records cannot believe that I had a full recovery. There's no Western medical explanation for this kind of recovery.
How many days was this?
I was in coma 7 days.
7 days. Okay, so start us on the journey.
Well, it all started in what I call the earthworm's eye view, a very primitive, coarse, unresponsive realm. I remember like roots or blood vessels all around me in this kind of murky darkness, and it seemed to go forever. Interesting thing about my NDE that's a little atypical is the fact that I had no memories of my life when I went through the whole thing. And initially, when I came back to this world, I said, well, I guess if with my neocortex so horribly damaged, I guess that might explain why I didn't have access to memories. But of course, I didn't realize all the memories were going to come back, which they did over about 2 months.
So what you're saying is when you were there, you didn't know who you were. You didn't know where you came from. You just were existing.
I had no words or language. I had no knowledge of Earth or this universe. It really was an empty slate.
No self-identity of Eben Alexander.
0. Every bit of that was gone extensively. And only much later, months and months later, did I begin to realize why that was an important feature of my NDEs. NDEs, as you hear, often have very common features. They don't depend on your religious background or anything else, even though your interpretation and reporting of it might depend on your religious background. But the content of the journey does not.
That's a great point. And NDEs are not just an American phenomenon. This is in all cultures, all religions, right?
Going back thousands of years to boot. I mean, in fact, one of the early recorded cases was from Plato 2,400 years ago of an Armenian soldier killed in battle who then came back to life on the funeral pyre. And his story was, when you die, you go through a review of your life, and the only thing that matters is how much love you manage to share with the world. That came out 2,400 years ago. This is not a New Age concept, this life review and the binding force of love that so many NDEers describe in that realm. Now, on my journey, that earthworm eye view was just the beginning, because there came a slowly spinning pure white light with a perfect musical melody.
Can we hear that white light stored? That's pretty common, isn't it?
Well, that's a big part of these stories. Is there's usually kind of a big differential between darkness and light, and often an emergence from darkness. For me, that darkness was really that earthworm eye view, and then this beautiful portal that opened up as this brilliant, slowly spinning light that came towards me, and ushered me up into this rich, ultra-real gateway valley.
I don't mean to interrupt, but I have to just say, I have heard scientists try to refute this white light common theme as a death of the brain and the neurons firing. And what do you think of that?
Well, there are many materialistic pseudo explanations for this kind of thing, like the tunnel vision, but they don't apply in full-blown near-death experiences, because there's far too much to explain, and things like a bright light and tunnel get far more complex than anything that can be explained with oxygen tension or CO2 levels. This is all discussed in a book called The Science of Near-Death Experiences by John C. Hagen III. It's all peer-reviewed medical scientific analysis of near-death experiences, both from physicians who have had them and physicians who study them. That book came out about 3 years ago, and it is a very strong supporter that the science of near-death experiences fully acknowledges the spiritual aspects of these journeys. You cannot dumb it down to the simplistic materialist pseudo explanations that have never really gone anywhere to describe the full spectrum of NDEs.
And the thing that I find interesting heading into your journey here, as you're getting ready to tell us, is that you talked about the Armenian soldier who died and came back, and he even said 2,500 years ago that our whole reason for being here is to learn to love. You are going to tell us about your experience, which I believe is similar. And then we've interviewed other people who have said the same thing. And it kind of across religions, beliefs, it's amazing to me that that is a very consistent outcome of these near-death experiences, that people have the same, takeaway from their experience.
Well, it's a lesson that is very important for this world to hear today, because I think the one thing that near-death experiencers would agree on over all the centuries, all the cultures and continents that they've occurred on, is that we are part of one mind, and that we are bound together through this incredibly powerful force of love. And the more that we can show kindness and compassion and forgiveness, not only to others, but to ourselves, the healthier this world will become, and the more we can lead ourselves into a pathway of true healing.
As a percentage, how many people, or what percent do you think of the population have had an NDE?
Well, the general estimates that come from Gallup polls and other scientific polls and studies is around 15%.
Wow.
So I would say 15 to 18%. Now, you got to remember that is a historical number that has to do with this in huge swathe of time when people wouldn't talk about these things. They're frightening, they're shocking, they're unbelievably unexpected. The thing that's so shocking about NDEs is that they're much more real than this world. More than half of NDEers report that a near-death experience is shockingly real. That's what I'm trying to tell you about that Gateway Valley that I encountered. It was much more real than anything I've ever experienced in this life. And I think part of the problem is during these spiritual experiences, you're really having a much more full-on contact to primordial consciousness and mind. In this world, in these bodies, in the material realm, all of our sensory systems and our brain are very actively filtering everything down to this tiny little trickle of information. And on these spiritual journeys, you've gotten rid of that filtering mechanism of the brain. It's one of the reasons why near-death experiences often say that the experience is ineffable. I cannot put it into words. I struggled for years over the words to put in proof of heaven, and I was finally, halfway satisfied. It was the best I could do. But our language is just really paltry at trying to explain these extraordinary spiritual experiences.
So what did you see coming out of that tunnel? What happened next?
In that beautiful Gateway Valley, I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. There were millions of other butterflies, all made of colors beyond the rainbow and flying in these vast spiraling formations. And down below us was this incredible meadow. It was verdant and alive and fertile, filled with lush life. And I remember as this butterfly would swoop down towards this meadow, all the flowers, blossoms, buds on trees, everything opening up in rich textures and colors, just incredible richness. And there were thousands of beings down in this meadow, and there was all this dancing and merriment and joy going on. And I remember children playing and dogs jumping, and the festivities were so rich because they were driven by up above these swooping orbs of pure kind of golden spiritual energy, leaving sparkling trails against that blue-black velvety sky. And those orbs, when I came back to this world weeks later, trying to write it all up, I called them angelic choirs. And they were emanating chants and anthems and hymns that would just thunder through me. And the best thing about this incredible journey in this beautiful valley with the sparkling waterfalls into crystal blue pools and all the joy and merriment and lush life and everything about it was I wasn't alone.
It's so puzzling to me to get your head wrapped around this in this afterlife, that there are entities of all ages. Everybody's not just a orb, but there's children, old people, and I just wonder how that's determined, or if they choose.
Well, I think one important concept to illustrate to you is that people often appear as their light body in that form. In other words, when we are going through this kind of experience, say a deathbed vision or something, we often will encounter souls of departed loved ones, but they don't look like they did the last time we saw them in the physical form.
Right.
They're in kind of a perfect form, often at kind of a perfect age. So they'll appear in their late teens, early 20s. And like my father, I tell that story in Living in a Mindful Universe, this extraordinary experience with my father, who had passed over 4 years before my coma, but was nowhere to be found in my near-death experience. That was a big shocker, but there was an important lesson involved. I explain all that in our third book,
You didn't see your father?
Not during the NDE, but I did encounter him more than 2 years later in meditation. And so that is a very important part of this, because what I'm trying to illustrate there is you don't need an NDE to know the kind of things that I know about the reality of this realm. Any conscious or sentient being can come into this knowledge with a regular program of meditation, of going within and exploring consciousness.
That's what I was going to ask you. Is that one way to get close to what you experienced, meditation?
Absolutely, and I can highly recommend it. For me, I use sacred acoustics. That's all something we explain in the book Living in a Mindful Universe. People can go to sacredacoustics.com to get their own tools and learn a whole lot more. But for me, it's a very powerful technique. I try to use sacred acoustics an hour or two a day for meditation. I've been doing that for more than 9 years now. And again, we go into great detail about how meditation can help anyone get to the same kind of knowledge in that book, Living in a Mindful Universe. But you don't even have to buy the book. You can just go on ebenalexander.com, and there's a little banner there on the welcome page, your 33-day journey into the heart of consciousness. That is a free 33-day email course, and anybody can participate. We've had more than 7,000 people from around the world participate in that course. They learn all the big, deep, novel concepts of where the scientific revolution is going, and some very practical tools for exploring consciousness and getting deep into kind of a centering prayer mode of exploration.
Before we move beyond it, in your NDE, can you give us an idea of the totality of what other things, what did you...
Yeah, let me just clarify that, because that Gateway Valley was not the end point. People would hear this much of the interview and say, oh, so that's heaven. No, it's not. That's where we reunite with our higher souls. That's where, souls of departed loved ones, and go through the lessons of our life. And that life review is all about learning lessons of love, because if you've handed out pain and suffering to others, you have to feel it during that life review. Now, in my journey, the angelic choirs provided yet another kind of portal into higher and higher levels. I remember seeing all of space and time in the material realm collapsing down. All of that deep spiritual realm that included that Gateway Valley also collapsing down. And that includes a whole different ordering of things called deep time, because time flow in that realm is different from time here. And that explains a whole lot of things, like how reincarnation can work, things like that. But let's just move forward. In my journey, that final portal led me into what I call the core. Infinite inky blackness, but filled to overflowing with that infinite healing power of love, that divine God force. That
did you meet God?
Modern times have described. I'm sorry, what?
I'm sorry. Did you meet God or an ultimate being?
That core realm was overflowing, and when I say overflowing, you need to envision the entire higher dimensional multiverse throughout all of eternity had been collapsed down into this tiny oversphere as part of the demonstrations of lessons of that core realm. But it was like swimming in the ocean, being deep in the midst of the Pacific of God force of pure love. But you find it is of a kind of a native intelligence, of pure wisdom, but also love, and also one with self. I mean, these are all concepts that our words and language do not really allow us to express in their best form. In that realm, one becomes one with that infinite force of love. That's why any judgment in a life review is with your higher soul. It's not any kind of higher form like a God judgment at all. It's just that in the brilliant light of pure love of that realm, all of those things we do as human beings that fall away from that and that show more kind of self-centeredness and being greedy and stuff like that is just so glaringly wrong in that life review environment with that beautiful loving force. Yes, that loving force is something that I became one with on this journey and still do in meditation.
When you were, I can't remember if you said, was it before or after you were there, that there was a girl there or a woman that was accompanying you?
That was in the Gateway Valley on the Butterfly Wing, which was kind of a midway point between the earthworm eye view and the core realm.
Can you describe her?
Oh, beautiful, sparkling blue eyes, high cheekbones, high forehead, broad smile. She had soft brown hair framing this lovely face. She was dressed in very simple garb, but colorful, indigo and kind of a powder blue and a kind of a soft pastel peach. Just this absolutely loving smile, a smile that was filled with unconditional love, and she never said a word. She never had to. Just in looking at me and communicating with me, this pure emotional and cognitive knowing of her experience. And it was reassuring me, you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You will be taken care of.
Are you saying there is not one central creator of the universe, one being?
No, there's one. Believe me, the answer is one. It's absolutely one. But the interesting thing is that we are one with that same force. I can tell you a lot of what I think about it now comes very directly from modern science, and specifically from the measurement paradox in quantum physics and where analysis of that issue is gone, and also from the hard problem of consciousness and the neuroscience of consciousness and philosophy of mind. And both these major scientific questions and modes of investigation are leading to the same conclusion, and that is that consciousness itself is primary in the universe, that there is a top-down ordering of events that is ruled from this mental realm. The scientific community for a long time has been mystified by quantum physics and where it tells us we need to be going in this. But one of the deepest lessons of quantum physics is that there is one mind and we're all sharing it. And so in essence, very much of my position on this, as expressed in Living in a Mindful Universe and in that 33-day course, and this is something that, of course, Karen Newell, my partner in all this and the co-founder of Sacred Acoustics, has a lot to do with, is the development of these ideas. But it really is about that one mind, and that we're all sharing that one mind when you realize all the evidence in scientific studies of non-local consciousness.
You're always going to have doubters, but you have other people in the medical community who have looked at your case, the state of your mind in this coma. Tell us about that and what veracity they added to what you were going through. I mean, how do you know it wasn't really a dream? I mean, what was going on and what is the neocortex?
Well, I think the main there was a lot of conjecture in the lay press early on, and it was conjecture and speculation that was based on no facts about my case. So the good news is now with this medical case report that came out in September 2018, and I said at the beginning of this interview how everybody can access that on my website. They can get right to that case report.
Okay.
That gets rid of a lot of that nonsense about, oh, well, he wasn't that sick, or this was due to medications, and all that conjecture from lay people who had no clue what they were talking about in the medical details of my case. Luckily, all that nonsense is now out of the way. And there are a lot of scientists in this world who fully realize the extreme challenge of my case and also how powerful it is at supporting the reality of these journeys and of the spiritual nature of human existence. And that's where I think this awakening in the scientific community is so important.
Now, the day that you actually, this is another profound part of that whole scientific validation, is the day that from what I read in your book, the day that you came out of this, your wife was actually talking to the head doctor, and he was essentially telling her it's time to pull the plug, because I believe it was you had a 2% chance of survival, but even if you came out of it, best case scenario was you would be completely debilitated in a nursing home. So you had 0% chance of any kind of a normal life. And what happened?
Right.
What happened with your son? Tell us about that day.
Well, it turns out that was really kind of the beginning of the coming back. And like you say, my doctors, I'd started out with a 10% chance of survival. Now we're down to a 2% chance of survival with no chance of recovery. That was day 7 of coma. It was a Sunday morning. They had protected my youngest son, Bond, who was 10 years old at the time. They'd protected him from the worst news during the week, but he was outside the room when he heard that conversation, and he came running down the hallway to ICU bed 10, where I was lying there on my stretcher on the ventilator with my eyes taped shut, as I had been for 7 days. And he pulled open my eyelids with one eye looking over there, one eye over there, both pupils unresponsive. Those of you in medicine know that's not a pretty picture. He was pleading with me, "Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay," as if somehow that would make it so. And it got through. Deep where I was in these spiritual realms, very far removed from this material world, far progressed along my pathway towards that afterlife, it got through. And
you heard him?
I had spent the vast majority of this journey thinking, without any memory, I had no commitments, I had no responsibility. So I thought this entire journey, it can continue, it can cease, doesn't matter. So I could be fearless. And now all of a sudden, with his pleading with me, even though I didn't even understand his words, but the emotional, the imploring nature of it all was drawing me back to this world, because I realize now all of a sudden it does matter. I have to start figuring this stuff out, because here's another soul in this universe who absolutely needs me. I must be there for him. I felt this strong sense of responsibility, even though I had no idea, that he was a son to me and that kind of human relation.
Doctor, I have a question for you. Dr. Eben Alexander we're speaking with here. So this message from your son, do you think it was auditory, physical, or do you think it was more of a spiritual?
Oh, it was spiritual. And believe me, I've been through so much in terms of thousands of cases, people I've talked to who've been through the same thing. And this is what I tell whenever I talk to nurses, doctors who are involved in caring for the terminally ill. It's the very same message: is assume that their soul is right there paying attention and aware, because there are tens of thousands of cases that have been studied that suggest that is the reality, and that we're not hearing with the ears and seeing with the eyes in these realms, but we actually have much greater channels of information.
When you the day you came out, I can't even imagine the look on the doctor's face and your wife after having just be given that news, and they enter the room and you sat up, right? You tell us about that.
Well, it's important to point out, I don't know if I clarified it enough in the book, but the reality is I did not recognize loved ones at the bedside. When I first started coming back to this world, all I remembered was where I had just been. In fact, when I was first coming to in that ICU bed, I still had no memories of Eben Alexander's life. My language was still gone, but the language came back extremely rapidly, literally within minutes and hours, a day or two. Language returned in giant fashion. Childhood memories came back over a few weeks, and literally by 8 weeks after waking up, everything had come back. In fact, I came to realize through conversations with close family and friends after that resembled conversations I'd had before the coma, that my memory return was even more complete than memories had been before my coma. And we talk about that in Living in a Mindful Universe, how one of the biggest nails in the coffin of materialist neuroscience is the fact that it doesn't appear that memories are physically stored in the brain at all. And that is a giant shocker, and yet that appears to be the case.
Wow.
Nurses have suspected that for a long time, just because no matter what we've done in millions of brain resections over the last century, there's never been a case of a documented swathe of long-term memory loss due to a neurosurgical resection.
Let's go back to, we have medical science now and doctors verifying your story, but let's go back to the beautiful young woman that carried you through this visit and what you later found out about her.
Right. Well, this is a little bit of a spoiler alert for those who haven't read Proof of Heaven, because I think it's one of the reasons why the book is so popular is the way she figures in the very ending of it all. It's really kind of shocking, and no question, it shocked me no end. And that story is a little bit long, but I'll try and be as brief as I can. It has to do with the fact that I was adopted. My mother was she was a sophomore in high school. My father was a senior in high school. This is back in 1953. There was no way for them to keep me, and so she left me off at the hospital when I was 11 days old, but she finally signed off on the papers to let me go, so I was adopted by age 4 months. Now, like many adoptees, I'd looked for my birth family and written to the children's home trying to find my birth mother, and they kept telling me, forget about it, she hasn't reached out to us. And so by my early 20s, I just let it go, and that's the way it should have stayed forever, except in the year 2000, my older son, Eben IV, was doing a school project in the 6th grade in family genealogy, and he urged me to write another letter to the children's home. He said, for my project, I need more information on our birth family. So I wrote another letter. I expected to get the same answer I'd always gotten before. And I got an answer. It was in February of 2000 when I was driving through a blizzard to go skiing with my son, Eben. And I remembered that the social worker at the children's home had asked me to call her that Friday afternoon. She might have some news. So I called her up, and she said, well, I did find something out. Are you sitting down? Well, I was driving through a blizzard, but I was sitting down. And so she said, your birth parents got married. Now, I cannot tell you what a shock that was, because the paltry information I had from the children's home many years ago had basically confirmed to me that my birth parents split up and went their separate ways.
Oh, wow.
So here in this one phone call, I'm finding out, no, they actually got married. And she said, there's more, at which point I did pull over to the side of the road because I knew this was really getting deep. She said they had 3 children, but your youngest sister died 2 years ago. That would have been in 1998. And they're still grieving her loss, so it's not a good time to come back in their lives. Now, I didn't realize it. That 2-minute phone call, just hung up and bah, that was the end of it. I just shoved it. I stuffed it. I had this anger inside, this perceived rejection by my birth mother as an adult.
Many people who have been adopted have that. I've noticed in my acquaintances, that's a real problem for people who are missing a parent or are adopted.
No matter how good the home is with the adopted home, because you had a great childhood too.
There's something missing, and I was raised by a single parent, and I know others that were adopted, and there is a hole deep down.
Well, there was definitely a hole, and also that hole can be made much worse when, as an adult, you're re-exposed to that same trauma of the abandonment. And that's what happened to me. And basically, in the year 2000, then, I stopped taking my sons to church. I stopped saying prayers with them at night. I quit believing in the power of prayer or in loving personal God. I just basically went into a purely agnostic position. And that's how it was. And then 7 years later, this is a year before my coma, walking on a beach in South Carolina, 2 of my sisters said, don't you think it's time you reached out to your birth family again? And of course, my first thought was no, because I knew how that had kicked me over into a dark night of the soul back in February 2000 when I had that perceived rejection. But they were right. They could tell there was kind of a hole in my core that I at least had to try. And so I wrote another letter to the children's home. This time I got a positive answer from a birth sister that, yes, we would love to meet. And in October 5th of 2007, I met them. Sorry?
That's cool. Very nice.
Yeah, it was amazing. Just a wonderful feeling to meet my birth parents. I'll never forget walking up to their door, and they also, it turns out they live in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and I had gone to undergraduate there. And of course, like many undergrads, you always think that your undergrad school is in this heavenly little town where everybody always has fun perpetually. I'd always thought that about Chapel Hill, and now all of a sudden I find out my birth parents actually lived there.
Of course.
October 5th is when I met them.
So the kick is coming, and here's the spoiler. The connection.
The spoiler alert.
The connection. What did you find out?
And what I found out there is it was still a painful memory for them to talk about very much, about Betsy, but I wanted to know so much more about her. And I remember my birth sister, Kathy, promised to send me a picture of Betsy one day, and that picture arrived 4 months after my coma. And that's the spoiler alert part, because when I saw that picture, I literally collapsed on the floor, could not stand up for 30 minutes. My heart was pounding. It completely astonished me no end, because I had spent the months since my coma deeply mystified by the presence of this beautiful young woman who I remembered so clearly from the experience that I knew her very, very well from that telepathic communication. And yet I also
same woman.
All of my reading that she should be somebody who was very important to me in my life. And yet I couldn't figure out who in the world she was.
And
that's
she's
why
your
4 months
sister.
after the coma, I got this beautiful picture in the mail from my birth sister Kathy of my departed birth sister Betsy.
It must have rocked your world.
Oh, I cannot tell you. In fact, I still get these chills and this pounding heart to even talk about it. I can tell you, when I tell this story in presentations, and I've told that story hundreds of times, my eyes start misting up, just this beautiful tears of pure happiness and joy, because that memory of putting that all together, realizing it's almost like she's looking at me in that picture as if to say, do you finally get it?
Was it healing?
Sorry?
Was it healing to the family that adopted you out? Was it healing to them to know that was the person that was with you? What was there? I don't think that you said anything about their response to that in the book.
Their response is that to them it has been, in many ways, a godsend. In so many ways, it's brought the ongoing spiritual reality and presence of beautiful Betsy, the lovely daughter that they lost tragically in 1998. They now can believe fully in the reality of her ongoing existence. And she has been such a gift to me. I've developed a much richer relationship with Betsy and with my adoptive father. And that's a story I tell much more fully in Living in a Mindful Universe. It's a fascinating story about how all of us can develop these relationships. You don't need an NDE to do this.
The sister that you never knew you had never met, carried you, connected with you in some interconnectedness of the universe in your visit to the afterlife. Do you suppose that she can see you today, or do you think there's a connection, a window?
Absolutely. In fact, I'll tell you, I mentioned minutes ago how I would often give presentations, and I would just feel my eyes misting and tearing and very emotionally engaged every time I told the story. And I, for a long time, thought, of course, it's emotional for me and powerful. But then it's when people, like I would present at the IONS meeting, where you have 300 near-death experiencers in the audience, and a lot of them have a very thin veil and very powerful intuitive abilities to see spirit world, and they would see this giant 12-foot golden angel standing behind me. People would take pictures, and in the picture would be these brilliant purple orb up there beside me. It's because Betsy's presence was truly there when I gave the presentation.
There is
scientists out there will say, "Oh, that's crazy, that's nonsense," but no, it's actually something that is very real, and I've come to see the reality of that through ongoing meditation and through all these other people who can see spirits.
There's a kid, his name is Josiah. I don't know if you've ever heard of the book Josiah's Fire, and he does talk about that. He was profoundly autistic, very low functioning. Basically, his mom was just trying to get him to spell something on the iPad one day, like red, after seeing the word, and they had gone through extensive interventions for him, and he started typing out all of these complex things like, God is a good gift giver, and she's like he wasn't even supposed to spell red, and so he's spelling, and so finally she asked him, she's like, Josiah, how are you learning all of this? And he said, at night Jesus comes and gets me and takes me to heaven and teaches me the order of sound. And then he started talking about family members that are in heaven, and he was telling her things that he could not have possibly known about them. And she's like, Josiah, what are you seeing? And she said, they know what's going on down here with us because they intervene for us up there.
They do. Absolutely. I would steer all of your viewers to GalileoCommission.org. Go to that website. There's all the information. I'm one of the 100 plus scientific advisors to that group. Karen and I were over in London, England last November to help launch the Galileo Commission report. This is a very profound statement. There are hundreds of scientists around the world, of scientists who study consciousness, who realize that our conventional science of materialism is completely wrong. It's not only off target, it leads you away from a lot of the deep truths that modern science is uncovering about the nature of reality that is very promising for all human beings. Our modern science is almost completely clueless on the nature of consciousness, the nature of mind and brain and their interrelationship. Now that's the conventional science I'm talking about. The Galileo Commission report, on the other hand, points a way forward that hundreds of scientists around this world are now beginning to realize that is much more about our connectedness and unification, much more about our spiritual nature and the reality of the spiritual universe. In fact, quantum physicists have been used to the idea of a mental universe for decades now. If you go back to look at the scientific journal Nature in the year 2005, Richard Conn Henry, who is the head of astrophysics at Johns Hopkins, wrote a one-page essay there called Mental Universe that was a very profound statement of the state of quantum physics in the current era moving forward that really indicates the primacy of consciousness and how we're really all sharing the one mind. This is extraordinary in terms of where it's going to lead us, even though one might argue that many of these deep truths have been with us for thousands of years.
A couple of takeaways when someone in the family, well, first is someone in the family, a friend is ill, the importance of being at their side and trying to communicate with them also raises the importance of like hospice workers and what role they must serve in this connection as people pass. And this pretty heavy stuff. And also beyond that, are we headed towards a culmination? All this information is it coming to us now for a reason at this time in history?
I would say it's a very important awakening. The damage from scientific materialism is quite extreme. I would say the false sense of separation, that we're all separate from each other, and that there's some competition and battle, survival of the fittest, is a warped interpretation of Darwinian evolution that's been greatly modified in modern biology to show that collaboration and cooperation between members of a species and between species are far more important at biological success than this mythical competition. And so we really kind of took some lessons of materialist science in the mid-20th century and took them at their worst. And they've helped us to be in conflict with each other, warfare, violence, economic conflict, trying to get the best of other people is completely wrong and antithetical.
So are we headed towards a change?
Yes, we absolutely are. It has to do with the scientific understanding of consciousness, support of this revolution that I'm talking about, and make no mistake about it, the scientists who study consciousness are far along the pathway that I'm pointing to. They're not hanging back there at materialism pretending that's going somewhere. Because
so
it doesn't. In the field of consciousness studies, it goes nowhere.
Does it tie in with the religious philosophies that there is a new world coming, a change, as far as that goes?
I would say it does, but this is really more about awakening to who we are and the true nature of reality and our connectedness. And so that is the big shift. And it is a shift that will absolutely bring more love, compassion, kindness, and forgiveness to this planet so that we all recognize we're in this together. We must take care of each other. Our slavery and worship of material wealth and goods is extremely damaging to our soul growth and to the spiritual nature of humanity. If people realize that when you die, your awareness doesn't just grind to a halt and you get your body buried in the dirt and that's the end of the story, but that in fact, it's basically the golden rule, do unto others as you would have done unto yourself, is written into the very fabric of the universe through what we go through when we die and leave this physical world. reunite with our higher souls and souls of departed loved ones.
Dr. Eben Alexander, can I ask you just a few things in closing? Number one, reiterate your contact information. Two, for those that would like to have an NDE experience without really actually having one, again, go through what we can do in our personal lives. And three, what are we going to talk about the next time we get together?
Oh, there's much more to talk about. It gets very deep. But to start with, go to ebenalexander.com. That's E-B as in Baker, E-N Alexander.com. And like I said earlier, when you first get to that landing page, there's a little banner that wiggles in your face, your 33-day journey into the heart of consciousness. I strongly encourage people to take that. It's a completely free course. It does involve several Sacred Acoustics offerings. You should also go to sacredacoustics.com. Karen Newell, my life partner, has put together an incredibly informative website to give people very powerful tools for exploration. I'll cut to the chase. These sounds of sacred acoustics, differential frequency brain entrainment, is so powerful, which you will see if you go to our testimonials page, because it's a sound that primarily influences the lower brainstem. By going at a circuit that's 300 million years old, it has far more power than all the other sounds we hear that influence our acoustic cortex that arose in the last few million years.
Does that have to do with the hertz, like at the higher and lower hertz?
It does, and basically it has to do with the fact that we are using those tones to try and influence your lower brainstem to oscillate at those lower frequencies, like delta and theta, like 3 and 6 cycles per second, 3 to 6 hertz, in an optimally harmonic state. But yes, those sounds are what we're doing to try and drive deeper frequencies, basically get people into that hypnagogic state between awake and asleep, which is so rich as a connection point between primordial consciousness and our human minds.
Dr. Eben Alexander, thank you for coming to the 13th floor.
Thank you
Rich,
so much.
Jamie, thanks so much for having me. And believe me, there's plenty more we can talk about next time.
We will.
Thank you very much.